So we have worked our way through who are all these people and entities and persons of the Trinity and all this kind of thing. And so now we're finally going to get into a little bit of what this class is really about, which is what can we learn from First Peter? How do we live out these truths that we've been talking about? Question, what should we do? And I think that this question is very important, and I think especially as Lutherans and other denominations that believe that it doesn't really matter what we do, we don't have to earn our salvation, God's grace is sufficient. I think we tend to downplay this question in some ways because we're afraid of turning it back into that earning your salvation kind of mentality. But when we talked about who is God, we talked about how we know God because of what God does. We understand who God is through God's actions. And I think that's true of us as well. If we are trying to imitate Christ, then the way that you imitate is not by just looking like, you imitate by doing like. And so I think once we place our actions in the correct context, that is not within the context of we are doing this to earn God's love or earn God's salvation, but we understand that we already have God's love, we already have salvation, we already have everything that we need, we can then turn around and say, okay, well, now that everything is taken care of and I don't have to worry and my identity is secure, how should I respond to that? What should I do with my life to show gratitude to God and to live out that identity that I know is strong and can never be taken away from me? And so I think that's kind of how we get to that question without turning it into a, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that in order to make sure that we're going to heaven kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important to make sure that we keep that in mind as we talk about this question, because we don't want it to unravel and go into that kind of place. So I think that's all I have to say in terms of introduction to this topic. So today we're going to look again at chapter 1. We've been doing a lot of chapter 1 study, but I think for me, chapter 1 really summarizes the whole thing, and then the rest of it is just kind of examples and further extrapolations of what is happening in chapter 1. So today we're going to look at generally verses 3 through 16, but in particular, we're going to look at verse 13 as its own kind of important, kind of key verse for us to take a look at for today. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with verse 13. And I'd like to hear verse 13 read in several translations so that we can kind of get a sense of the message of verse 13 from some different angles. So my verse 13 in the NRSV says, "Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Discipline yourselves. Set all your hope on the grace that Jesus Christ will bring you when he is revealed." And I've got a little footnote here that says that instead of prepare your minds for action, it could also say gird up the loins of your mind. That's what it literally says. Gird up the loins of your mind. So what else do all of you have in your different translations? Or if you don't have any other translations, I can pull up some because I've got the internet version here.
Mm-hmm. I've got the same.
Yeah, mine's the same.
Mine's different.
Okay, let's hear it. I love yours, Pam.
I think mine only puts blocks in like 13 through 16. So I think it's just the first sentence is 13.
Probably.
So roll up your sleeves, put your mind in gear, be totally ready to receive the gift that's coming when Jesus arrives.
Awesome. I like that one. What do you have, Steve?
Mine's NIV. It's close to yours. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed.
Okay. Yeah, so probably most of them will have something like that. Let me see what the good old King James tells us. That's always an interesting one with the these and thous. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So that one uses that literal translation, gird up the loins of your mind. I really like that, that idea. So in the ancient world, everybody wore kind of robes and long dress kind of shapes, clothing. And so when you were to go into battle, that could really get in your way. It's hard to run when you've got a kind of skirt on or wrapped up with cloth. And so what they would do is they would, if you can imagine, wearing a robe or a skirt, what they would do is they would kind of reach between their legs and they would grab the back of the material that was kind of running down the back of their body, and they would pull it up between their legs, and then they would tie it off to almost kind of like make a diaper type of look, so that their the skirt part of their robe was not dragging on the ground or preventing them from moving. And that's how they would prepare themselves for battle. They would gird up their loins, they would tie up their robes so that they had freedom of movement and could run quickly and engage in battle without tripping or having their robes snagging on anything. And so what this person is indicating here is that we're going into battle, that this is a serious thing that we are preparing ourselves to engage in here. It's not just preparing your mind in a way, but it's also preparing your body. It's preparing your whole life in terms of the potential negative consequences that are coming. And we're going to talk more about that part next week.
So Katie, do you think mankind developed pants because they went to war so often?
Probably. Probably. At least part of it anyway. I have no evidence for that, but that makes
it out.
That makes a lot of sense.
Horses.
Yeah, horses. That would make sense too. Riding a horse is a lot less comfortable when you're wearing a long skirt or robe.
That's probably why the skirts got shorter.
Yes.
Yeah. Although if they're longer, they're easier to wrap around. So interesting.
I always wonder about the kilts. I think those were designed for battle also, the kilts.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about that history.
That's probably a sideline of ours, right?
Somebody can look that up. Look up the development of clothing and come back and let us know. All I know is that you tie up your robe so that you can battle in the ancient world.
I don't think I've ever heard that before. That thought of being ready for battle that way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's new.
It never occurred to me that their clothing had something to do
really
with it.
hard to go out in a caftan, I think. I don't know. So
Next class, Katie's going to be clothes of the Bible.
Yeah, be careful. You talk about it too much and I'll make a whole lesson on it. All right, so would somebody be willing now to kind of read this in context? So mine starts, most of them seem to start with therefore, and in verse 13. And whenever you see a therefore, you always want to read back behind what you've read, because the verse that you're reading kind of, you know, relies on that. It's the continuation of the thought. It's the cause of the effect that you're reading, that kind of thing. So if someone would be willing to start with verse 3 and then read a little bit past our verse all the way up to 16, would give us a little context for our focus verse today.
I'll read.
Thanks, Linda.
Okay. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who are being protected by the power of God through faith, for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, even if now for a little while you have had to suffer various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold, that though perishable is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Although you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy, for you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that was to be yours made careful search and inquiry, inquiring about the person or time that the Spirit of Christ within them indicated when it testified in advance to the sufferings destined for Christ and the subsequent glory. It was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves, but you, in regard to the things that have now been announced to you through those who brought you good news by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things into which angels long to look. Therefore, prepare your minds for action, discipline yourselves, set all your hope on the grace that Jesus Christ will bring you when he is revealed. Like obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance. Instead, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct. For it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy.
Thank you, Linda.
There's some long sentences in there.
Yes, yes. This is not Paul, but certainly sounds like it with all the run-on
Yeah.
sentences. But that's kind of part of why, you know, scholars don't think that this was actually written by Peter, because he was a poor fisherman. I mean, could he even read in his
Yeah.
native language, let alone read and write in this flowery, complicated grammatical Greek that we have here? And then we translate it to the best of our ability into English and end up with these long, long run-on sentences, and you can barely make sense of them as you're reading them.
As you're
with
reading,
commas and-
where is this going?
yes, what's my inflection
Where's-
supposed to be here?
Is there a comma coming?
So I think, you know, with that therefore, we should often ask ourselves the question,
Huh.
why? So our therefore tells us that we need to prepare for action or gird up our loins. And so we ask the question, why? And that question can be answered usually with what comes before. So if you look at verses 3 through 12, how would you answer the question, why are we to prepare our minds for action?
So they're anticipating salvation.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be prepared for.
So salvation is coming, so be prepared for that.
Yeah, well, 12 says it was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves, but you. And so it's kind of a thing of you need to be ready to do the next step, which is serving God and seeing all these things that have been promised to you.
Mm. So you are kind of part of the culmination of history, all of these important figures that came before you prophesied of this, hoped for this, received the promise of this, but now it's actually been revealed, and you are going to be the recipients of it.
So don't like 3 through 5 kind of make the statement, and the rest of it kind of explains it, doesn't it?
Mm. Yeah, so why are we doing this? Because we have received this new birth.
Yeah.
So that was the verse we looked at last week. And so really at the heart of it, I think the answer to why are we doing this is because this is who we are. Because this is who God created us to be, because this is the gift. Any other thoughts about the why?
Well, for one thing, God's watching. I think that seems to be like mother's watching. You better behave yourself at the movies. It's kind of you're responsible to be good. So I don't know. That's what it says here. God is keeping careful watch over us and the future. So
Yeah,
that
so
must
you
be
can
about
you can
4.
read that as a promise, as you know, as a comfort. You can read that as a tiny bit of a threat, a reminder that you know that God is watching.
And when you've seen what God can do, part seas, burn bushes, flood the earth, it is kind of a reminder to mind your business,
Mm,
I would think back in the day.
yeah, that God has the sovereignty. God's sovereignty can be a comfort, but it can also be a threat.
It seems to me like this part just gives us the essence of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
This is what it's all about. We can throw the rest of the book away because this is it. I mean, not really, but you know what I mean. This is just boiling it all down into a simple way for people to understand. Look, you've been given this incredible gift, and all you have to do is prepare your mind and your heart and your soul to receive it. And it'll be there for you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You have new life and everything to live for, including a future in heaven, and the future starts now. So
Mm. Yeah, I like that. You have everything to live for, and that future is now.
I'm gonna write that down.
Why do these guys have to be so bombastic and verbose? Not just- yeah.
You know, I criticize these Greek writers for their long run-on sentences that seem to go on forever. But then whenever I'm trying to formulate something in the church, like a vision statement or mission statement or summary of some kind, I find myself going in the exact same direction because you want to say so much. It's so important to get this idea and this idea and this idea in there. And then you end up with these huge sentences that, use all this kind of, jargony, churchy language that people don't always completely understand. But it's so hard not to go there when you're talking about these complicated theological ideas. So I kind of, to some degree, I sympathize with them, but I wish that we could figure out a way to say these things in a much simpler way and not use so many words so people could hear the messages more clearly.
In verse 3, is that verse 3? Yeah, I like the phrase living hope.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
That's just embodied in our lives and how we live our lives. It's more than just something out there
Yeah.
in the future.
And the more we live it, the more it becomes real to us and to others around us, and kind of,
Yeah, it's like impossible to have the hope without living it.
yeah.
Well, maybe not impossible.
Harder, less likely to be noticed. All right, so then I only added a few verses after 13. I mean, we could have kept going through basically the entire rest of the book for this part, but I think when we get those therefores in the Bible, so we ask the question, why are we doing this? Why are we being told to prepare? And then after that, I think basically the entire rest of the letter is asking the question and answering, how do we do this? So the 3 verses, after, tell us how we are to prepare, how we are to discipline ourselves, how we are to set our hope on Christ. So what do you see there that answers that question?
Where are we looking?
Verses 14 to 16 now.
Oh, okay.
Or basically anything after, if you would prefer.
And what was the question?
How are we to do this? So we get our charge. Prepare yourself.
I think it says here, when Jesus wraps this all up, it's your faith, not your goal, that God will have on display as evidence of his victory. But that's before, so he's gonna look to see what you're doing, not how much you earned. So
Mm.
Well, it's when they're being told to be holy,
Mhm.
they're also said to live your lives as a stranger.
So be different.
he won't let you get by with sloppy living. Shape up. The shape up is my translation, not Peterson's.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I love this. It cost God plenty to get you out of that dead end, empty-headed life you grew up in. So,
Mhm.
We owe God something, not.
Get to 22, it says, love one another deeply from the heart.
Yeah, I like 22. Yeah.
as if
Mhm.
your lives depended on it.
Because it does, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the face of persecution.
What's your poem say? You have a poem in around 25?
Mhm.
24.
The poem. Okay.
The indented stuff.
Yeah. I mean, this is pretty, I think it's pretty cool, the poem I've got here in Peterson.
Go ahead and read it.
The old life is a grass life, its beauty short-lived as wildflowers. Grass dries up, flowers droop, God's word goes on and on forever.
Hmm.
Is that
Yeah,
what y'all?
Mhm.
that's a good translation of
Yeah.
that.
Because it's from Isaiah. It says,
So this section really helps me with some of the stuff that comes later that I have a really big problem with. So Anything else here before we take a look at something else?
We want to know what you have a problem with now.
Well, we'll get there. I just didn't want to move on too quickly.
The whole thing is, though, is how are we supposed to do that? How are we supposed to be holy?
Mm,
I mean, every day you just fall way short of being holy.
mhm.
I wouldn't even use that word to think of myself, you know? So I don't know that. So one of your questions was, how is your life different because you are a Christian? Well, it is, but I don't know how to explain that. But do I feel holy? I don't know.
I don't think we're the right generation to feel that good about ourselves. We weren't brought up that way. Or I wasn't. I mean, it's like it's inappropriate to think well of yourself.
So it's interesting how over the course of time that word holy has kind of morphed in its meaning.
Yeah.
I think today when we think of holy, we think of, better, more perfect,
Holier than thou.
yeah, better behaved or better controlled or better disciplined or something like that. But originally the word holy just meant separate.
Set apart.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I do feel separate.
Yeah. And so I think that's, what Linda said, holier than thou. I think that's kind of what happened to it was, well, I'm separate, therefore I'm special, therefore I'm better than you. And so holy kind of developed into this idea of, the word itself means different and better and special.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that makes more sense. That I like that one. But there's times when you're in a group or somebody's saying something and you can't participate. I feel it a lot on Facebook because people will post things, and if you don't agree, then there's something wrong with you. But I don't just follow along with what everybody else says.
Mhm.
And I don't like some of the things where they test your faith kind of thing, where they say, well, if you really believe, you'll do such and such. To me, that's just a chain letter. And I don't participate in them. It's not that I'm not a Christian, but I'm not going to follow the crowd,
Mhm.
I am separate. I am different. That's a good way to look at that. I didn't think about that. And that part of me is holy because of God. I can do that.
Marge and Bill, you didn't get my text message earlier.
Don't try to blame Bill.
I sent you a text because today we started half an hour early.
Oh, really? We were busy.
Not you, Marge.
It's Bill's
Marge.
fault. It's Bill's fault.
Oh, good, I'm off the hook.
It was yesterday, I think. Yeah.
I remember that now.
Sorry about that. That's all right.
I know I needed the reminder.
So you just missed some introductory, and we were looking at chapter 1 and talking about we're focusing today on our focus verse is chapter 1 verse 13, which says, therefore prepare your minds for action, discipline yourselves, set all your hope on the grace that Jesus Christ will bring you when he is revealed. And so we've been talking about how pretty much the whole rest of the book is helping us to understand how to do that. How do we prepare our minds for action? How do we discipline ourselves? What does that look like? so that we can kind of understand a little bit more about what should we do now that we know who we are, now that we know who God is, what should we do about that? And I think
Yeah,
pretty much
yeah.
the entire rest of the book is answering that question. How do we do it? What should we do?
Now, be honest, Katie, we talked for 10 minutes about pulling a robe up between your legs. And
Yes, we also
Diapers.
we did talk a little bit about clothing today and the development of clothing, because that prepare your mind for action is literally translated gird the loins of your mind. And so we talked about what that means.
I think I'm glad that we missed it.
So next, what we're going to do is take a look at some of the passages that, or at least a little bit, that I really have struggled with. And I think that looking at it from this perspective really helps, but it also helps us to kind of think about our own context. Because when I said, at the very beginning, and even in my little teaser blurb advertisement, I said, I think that of all the times that Christianity has existed, we have more in common with these people than we do with any of the ones that lived during a time when Christianity dominated. From when Constantine established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, all the way until, and there's no exact date, but certainly in the 50s and 60s and even 70s, it was still expected, even 80s really, it was expected that you were at church. It was kind of culturally required. If you were the butcher in town and you weren't seen in your pew on Sunday, then people thought you were morally corrupt, and so they wouldn't shop at your shop. And that's not the case anymore. There's no requirement for you to fit into society that you be a member of a church. And so I think that, that connects us to these people, because they're living in a place where being Christian is countercultural. Being part of a church is countercultural. The idea of spending your time and your money and your energy on this Jesus thing is different, is weird. And that's how these people are experiencing this as well. But I think we have a lot of things that we don't have in common with these people, because even though we are called to be holy, which we were just defining not as special and better than anybody else, but holy just means separate, set apart. And so if we are to be set apart, if we are to be separate, if we are to be different, then we have to kind of define on who it is that we're being different from. Who is it that we are engaging with, and how are we supposed to be different? And so I'd like us to look next at chapter 2, verse 18. And we're going to get into a little bit of this stuff that, as I mentioned before, I really don't like very much, but I think will become at least a little clearer as we think about it from this perspective of how do we act holy? How are we different?
What chapter?
So, chapter 2, verses 18. And we don't have to read a whole bunch of it, maybe just 21. So 2:18 to 21. Would somebody be willing to read that for us?
I can read it.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay. It says, slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps.
All right. So what is this telling us? if we read this literally, just what it says on the face of it, what is this suggesting?
That slavery is kind of a normal thing.
Yeah. Slavery is to be accepted as normal and acceptable.
Be a good slave.
Yep.
If you go ahead, it says, this is the kind of life you've been invited into, the kind of life Christ lived. He suffered everything that came his way. So you should be doing the same thing, basically.
Yeah, from within your position as a slave, right?
Well, I don't have slavery mentioned in my book, but yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I can,
Who's it addressed to in verse 18? What does it say?
18 says, you who are servants,
Oh,
be servants to your masters. So it's a slightly different take.
Interesting.
yeah.
But then it goes on the same way, be good to the good ones and the bad ones. So,
Yeah, so that's a little bit troubling to me that, you know, yes, we are called to be like Christ and to not return abuse and not threaten. But we've kind of talked about this before. Are we really supposed to just take everything that comes our way and never stand up for ourselves, or, you know, see others suffering and not stand up for them because
how comes in?
that's the way it ought to be?
But that's the second mile part. When that's illegal.
It's not illegal to beat your slave, though.
No. But when Jesus said, if they ask you to carry their stuff for a mile, go the second, and that was illegal. That was kind of
Yes.
like, that was
Yes.
rebellion.
Yes, undermining the law there.
Mm.
All right, well, let's make this even worse and go to chapter 3.
That's worse.
Oh,
And who would like
I
to
don't like this
read?
one.
Who would like to read a little bit here?
Husbands.
Ah, I'll read it.
All right.
Am I on? Yeah. Authority of your husband, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wife's conduct when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Rather, let your adornment be the inner self with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. It was in this way long ago that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is good and never let fears alarm you. How long do I have to read?
You can stop whenever you want.
Wait, Karen,
Huh?
as for you husbands, it's the next line.
I know.
Okay.
Pam wants to hear about the husbands.
Husbands, in the same way, show consideration for your wives in your life together, paying honor to the woman as the weaker sex, since they too are also heirs of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing may hinder your prayers.
All right. So I often will cite this when, you know, when I'm kind of being self-disparaging and talking about how, like, I don't bother with makeup. I have my hair pulled up in a bun every day because I don't really feel like doing anything else with it. I wear my t-shirts. Well, this says I'm not supposed to adorn myself outwardly. But, you know, accept the authority of your husbands.
Now that means you got to go along with all of it. You could go for that.
Right, right. If I go along with some, then do I have to finish the whole rest of it?
It's a process, Linda.
So what is this telling us?
That they lived in a different time.
Yeah, but look how long it's taken us to get over it.
Yeah.
So to me, and you know, different people will interpret this different ways and tell me that I am just trying to make excuses for myself so that I don't have to live under the boot of my husband. But to me, I think the most important thing that I get from this kind of stuff is that the being different, the holiness that we are called to is a holiness that we need to live out from within the culture that we live in. And so we are not called as Christians to remove ourselves from our society, to stop interacting with anyone who might not believe in the same way that we believe. You know, even here we've got wives whose husbands are not Christians, attempting to win them over by their wives' conduct. And so that to me indicates that, you know, you don't have to leave your husband if he's not a Christian. You don't have to leave your wife if she's not a Christian. You don't have to stop being friends with the people that were your friends before you became a Christian, or, you know, now that you're kind of renewing your faith and deciding that you're going to live this way. You don't have to quit your job. You don't have to leave your home. You don't have to, you know, go live in some commune somewhere or something with only Christians and never interact with the rest of the world. In fact, the part of the purpose of this is that witness to the world, is that interaction. How can you be different if there's nothing to be different from? You need that contrast. You need that interaction with the world so that you know what it is you're doing and why and how to do it. And so for me, I don't take these kinds of things about slaves and wives to be instructions that are applicable for all time in their, you know, in the details of them. I don't take any of the rest of the, you know, very specific instructions that way either. What I do with this is I go back to chapter 1, verse 13, and I say, okay, so if the whole rest of this book is answering that question, how do I prepare myself? How do I live in this holy way that God is calling me to live? How do I behave differently in the way that I live my life so that people notice that I'm a Christian and see that as a positive thing, not as a negative thing? Then what does that look like for me within my context? In this context, slavery is acceptable. And so the people aren't saying, well, if you're a slave, you need to escape from slavery because we don't believe in slavery. And then you need to, you know, spend the rest of your life on the run. What they're saying is, from within your life already, what can you do to express the love of God, to express the importance of Christ in your life? To not just be different for the sake of being different, but to be different for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the one who did all of those things for you that we talked about in verses 3 through 12, who gave you that gift, who gave you that salvation, who made it so that you could live in this way and feel that grace and love and confidence in your identity as God's child.
Katie, do you think, okay, so 8 is being a very nice person, be agreeable, be sympathetic, be loving, compassionate, humble. But then I wonder, then how do you stand up for the right? So down at 13, it says, if with heart and soul you're doing good, even if you suffer for it, you're still better off. So is that where we get over the modern day opposition to evil and bad things? And
so I think that comes to kind of the problem with what it is that I'm saying here. Because if we read this and we say, oh, okay, so this is an instruction manual and it tells us exactly line by line what we're supposed to do, it's not easy in terms of, you know, being subservient and taking abuse and all these things. I'm not saying it's easy in terms of that, but it's easy to understand what you're supposed to do, even if it's hard to do it. Whereas if you take my tack and you say, okay, well, this is from a particular culture, and what this is telling me is I have to look at my culture and I have to figure out, what does it look like to be holy? What does it look like to live out those truths of who I am and the gifts that God has given me? But I can't just take this as on its face as the guideline for that because I don't live in the same culture as these people. Then that's a lot harder. and it turns into, you know, a huge discernment project to figure this out. Because for these people, they have no power at all. They are not citizens of the Roman Empire. So literally anybody who has any kind of power can do anything they want to them. They can just kill them on the street and there are no repercussions for that, because they are not considered basically human. They're not considered of any value whatsoever. And so the person who's writing this letter kind of has to walk that fine line. Here are the ways that you live a faithful life, while also, to a certain degree, doing the best you can to protect yourself. Yes, it's really important that you continue to meet together and eat together, because that is something that that Jesus, you know, ordained for us to do. Yes, it's important for you to show that sympathy and love and tender heart and humble mind to each other and to the whole world. But when you suffer, you shouldn't fight back, because if you do, all that's going to do is just result in your death. Fighting back in any way, whether standing up verbally or standing up physically, is going to result in nothing but the destruction of the community, because there's nothing that they can do that would actually be successful. And then the author kind of gives reason for that. Be like Jesus. He didn't return anything. He didn't say anything. He didn't fight back. Be like Jesus. And so that's kind of how he you know, justifies his advice. But again, we live in a very different culture than this. We do have rights. We do have ways that we can reach out and try to make change in ways that are not going to just result in nothing but our own deaths. We can, you know, we can vote. We can convince other people to vote in the same way as us. We can petition. We can protest. We can go and talk to our elected officials to try to get changes to take place on a larger scale. And so we have to decide if we can do those things, and that can, you know, help to make us holy, to make us set apart, to reveal to the world who we are and whose we are. Should we be doing that, or should we be following more the letter of this letter and you know, sitting back and suffering for doing what is right, and not standing up, not trying to make that change, not even standing up for others, because like it said, you know, slaves are supposed to take it. If you're getting abused, take it, like Jesus took it. And so depending on, you know, where you come down with this and how you make these decisions, being a Christian today could look vastly different. One Christian could be walking down the street and see somebody getting beat up in the middle of the street and say, oh, well, that person is probably getting beat up because of their faith, and that's a good thing, and so I'm not going to interfere there. And then the next person could come along and be also a Christian and say, oh my gosh, my job is to stop this suffering because God would want me to stop this suffering. And so they'll run out into the street and, you know, try to break up the fight or whatever's going on. And in terms of, you know, logically interpreting this text, you can really come to either conclusion. So at the end of the day, you have to go back to those first questions we were asking. Who is God? What is it that makes me a Christian? And how can this decision that I'm making here about this guy in the middle of the street getting beat up, how can that express to these people in this situation who God is and who I am best? So I think that's what we have to ask ourselves when we're talking about, you know, doing our faith in context. And so to me, there is no question, because letting the person get beat up is not good news to that person or to the person doing the beating up, really. They just don't know it.
We had a story. I was in a master's program for social work like 11 years ago now, long ago. And one of our professors was talking about the time he was in Great Falls, Montana. And he was at a Burger King there. And he noticed that there was a Native American man wanting to order a hamburger. And white people kept coming in and coming in and coming in. And the staff kept waiting on the white people and not the Native American fellow. And it made our professor really unhappy. So he went up and kind of let the staff know that this man needed to be served, he needed to be waited on. And apparently the staff wasn't impressed with that. So we talked to the manager and he got the guy a hamburger. But instead of saying thank you, the Native American said, I have to live here and you're leaving.
Mm.
Mm,
This always gave me that extra, yeah.
Yeah. So there's no, it's never, I don't think it's ever clear cut, you know, when I decided to go to seminary and work toward, you know, working with people. My mom was a math teacher, and she said to me, you know, math is really easy because it's always the same answer. It's never complicated. And so I love math because it's assured. You're going to be working not with numbers but with people. And when it comes to people, there's never 100%. Everything's always different. Any tiny little change in circumstances is going to completely change the equation for you. And so your answers are going to be really difficult to come by. And that's true. You know, that's very true. Whenever people are involved, it's never clear cut. And so I think that's why we have to keep in mind, you know, who is the Holy Spirit there with us, helping us to discern, helping us to make the right choices. And hopefully we practice opening ourselves up to that so that we, you know, make the right choice more often than not, and don't just, you know, make it based on what we think or what we want every time.
I keep thinking how this advice is so different from the slaves in Egypt
Mm,
being led by Moses to stand up and leave.
yeah,
In pretty much the same situation in some ways.
yeah. So do we read that as, well, it's more convenient for God to do this time and do this time? Or do we read that as, you know, this is within context, the best way to survive and thrive and potentially share that message with others?
I don't know how to read it.
well, I'm thinking that it depends on the people involved and the gifts that they have, because we're not all the same and we don't react all the same to everything. Just like you were saying, there's never just one set thing that we do. And so that's why it's so hard sometimes to think about the things that people do in the name of Christianity, because they're all so different and they're also hard to understand sometimes. How can you say that you're doing this from a Christian viewpoint when it is so diametrically opposed to what I believe or what I think or how I feel? Because I know I'm a Christian, so why aren't we the same, you know? But we have different gifts and we have different ways to express those gifts. And I'm not a fighter, but given the right circumstance, I would probably try to stand up for somebody,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
And I think that's why it's so important for us to keep that number one question in our face, because sometimes I think Christians of you know, good intention can have very different and almost sometimes seemingly opposite views. But I think a lot of times we forget that question, who is God? And we start making decisions about our faith based on what I believe, based on what I think, based on what I want, rather than based on who God is, and therefore who I should be, who I'm supposed to be, who I'm created to be. And so it can't ever be that anything a Christian ever decides to do is right because that was their personal discernment. It has to be, does this fit into who God is? And now, of course, answering that question, who is God, is also, in some ways an individual thing. And
Yeah.
so that, that adds another layer of complication onto it. But I think, if we are faithful Christians and we're in community with one another, and we have Christian friends who are making choices that we see as problematic, I think the way into that conversation is to ask, to very gently start asking that kind of question. Based on this decision that you're making and what it is that you're doing here, who is God to you? How do you answer that question, who is God? And does what you're doing fit into your definition of God? And if not, can we talk about that? Would you mind if I shared who God is to me and how I understand who God is and how I understand our role in this world? And so I think that those conversations, and I think that's why we are in community. We're not left alone to figure these things out, because they are so complicated and so complex and so difficult to navigate. And so we have each other to kind of bounce ideas off of and help, especially when you're in the midst of a situation, it's hard to kind of go back to that basic foundation. Who is God? Answering that question first, I think, will make it much clearer how to proceed when you're trying to make decisions. But it's hard when you're in the decision making place to stop yourself from all the anxiety and worry and frustration and urgency, to step back and ask that question. All right, so I've got to head out in just a couple minutes, hopefully, cross fingers to get my shot. But I wanted to hear a little bit from you on question number 1. How would your life be different if you weren't a Christian? How is your life different because you're a Christian? Did anybody come up with anything on that one?
Well, I was thinking it kind of depends on different than what. So if you had no religion, I imagine with Christianity, you've got guidelines and you've got God's love. If I was a Muslim, I don't think I'd have as much freedom as I have now. So it kind of depends on different than what. I think the love and the God's guidance are big for Christians. And that's big for society because it gives us a guide to go by to treat each other well. But other religions have that too. So it's an interesting question, Katie.
Well, I think it's the difference between how you feel things and what kinds of blessings you see. Like there's a lot of different circumstances in your life. And I know that there are some, I've talked to some people and they're going through something that's very similar to what I went through. And all they see is the pain of it, the difficulty, Whereas I look at it and I think, but don't you see how this happened? And that was good because God was there anyway, whether you know it or not, God was there and he saved you from this thing and this thing and gave you this blessing. I don't know how to explain it, but I see that's what the difference is for me, is that in almost any circumstance, you can see where God is. And I think if I didn't have that, I would have jumped off a bridge a long time ago. Because what would be the point if I wouldn't have felt the joy, I don't think, that I have felt in my life if it hadn't been for God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
giving you that ability to interpret what happens to you and find meaning, find that thread that connects everything.
Well, and the strength of it,
Mhm.
the power of it. It's just incredible to me to know that God has always been with me, you know. And we talked that one lesson, we were talking about times when we had felt the Holy Spirit or seen God or those kinds of things. But they happen so often that sometimes we just kind of glance over them, and then sometimes they make us just stop and say, oh yeah, you know, like I've been so worried about Jack since he moved to Willow Springs, because he has been in the hospital 5 times, and each time he came out, he had to be in isolation.
Mm.
So he wasn't able to interact with other people or anything. And a couple of weeks ago, I went to visit, and his caregiver told me, started talking. He said, well, you know, he sits at the table in the dining room and eats with other people. And he has a friend. I told you this the other day. He has a friend. And I just felt God touched me on the shoulder and say, it's going to be okay, Karen. It's going to be okay. You did the right thing. And where would I be without that? I would be as depressed as I am all the other times I don't feel that. You know, it's like, it just pulls you out of the moment and lets you see something bigger and better that you can't even comprehend.
Mhm.
Anyway, I know you guys probably get so tired of me talking about all this stuff.
No, no.
I had made the vow I wasn't going to say anything like that today.
No, I think sharing, you know, who we are and taking what we're talking about and applying it in those ways is really valuable and inspiring to others. You know, I think as Lutherans, we don't witness enough. We don't share our stories enough. We don't make ourselves vulnerable in those ways nearly enough. Any other final thoughts?
Mm.
All right. Well, I would like to leave you with one final question that we're going to talk about next week. And this is a bit of a I can't think of what word I want. It's a challenging question. It's a thought-provoking question. And here's the question is, think about your church. We didn't get to talk about, you know, what is the church today and what's the purpose of the church. We talked a little bit about community and why we live in community as Christians, but think about your church. And I want you to think about if that church were to close today, shut up the doors, nobody ever worships there, nobody ever does any activities there, it's just gone. Would the community around the church notice? Would they care that that happened? Would there be any difference for them if that occurred? And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week.
Wow.
Did you tell Bob about that question?
No, I didn't, but maybe I should. Maybe some more people need to think about that. So I'll include that question in my email. It's not really part of the journal, but it's something that we'll talk about next week. And then we've got our journal questions. So next week we're talking about what are the consequences of what we do. And I'd like you to think about your average day. Why do you do the things that you do in your average day? What's your motivation for doing them? And then when do you think about the consequences of your actions? Do you stop before you act and think about what might happen? Or do you wait until the consequences hit and then you start thinking about, oh yeah, I guess that is a consequence of that. And then finally, I guess this is similar to, you know, the question I just asked, but in a more positive way. If we were to make changes in our daily living and in what our churches do based on the mission of the church that we discussed last week, So that was today, what we talked about, who we are and who we as a community are supposed to be. What are some possible positive and or negative consequences of those changes? So what do you think? What do you think would be some things that we need to do? If the community wouldn't notice if we closed our doors, then what should we do to change that? And then what would be some possible consequences of those changes? So those are our questions for next week. And next week is our last one in this session. And so next week we can talk a little bit too about what we'd like to do next. So any other thoughts for this week?
Probably not the history of clothing, actually.
Not the history of clothing. We don't want to do that next. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming, and sorry, Margin Bill, that you missed the beginning. If you want to, you can go on and listen in. I'll post it on YouTube probably by tomorrow. I usually do by Friday, so you can listen to the beginning of our class, or come tonight if you want to come for half an hour and catch up that way too, if you'd rather. All right.
Thanks.
Well, thanks everybody for being here. I will see you again next week. Wish me luck. Hopefully
Thanks,
I'll be
Katie. Yeah.
successful here.
Yeah, hope you get
Yes.
one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.